You have two choices: stay inside and slowly run out of something essential, or leave your safe haven and face whatever is waiting outside. And the terrifying part? Your survival plan may have created the problem. You spent months preparing for the day everything went wrong. Food stacked neatly against the wall, water stored in containers, batteries charged, medical supplies organized, doors reinforced, windows covered. You chose the location carefully, far enough from the city to avoid the crowds, close enough to civilization to reach supplies if you needed them. It felt safe, until the first thing you couldn't replace stopped working. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether your shelter could keep people out. It was whether it could keep you alive. Because the most dangerous flaw in a survival shelter isn't always the door. Sometimes, it's the system you forgot was connected to it. Imagine waking up 3 days after a major disaster. The electricity is still gone. Your phone has no signal. The roads outside are nearly empty. And for the first time, your house feels exactly like what you wanted it to be. A place separated from the chaos. You have food, you have water, you have a way to cook, you have somewhere to sleep. So you tell yourself the hardest part is over. Then you check the water and realize you're using it much faster than you calculated. Drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning wounds, flushing, basic hygiene. Every ordinary activity is quietly consuming the resource your entire plan depends on. And now you have a problem. Because a shelter doesn't necessarily fail when the walls collapse. It can fail much earlier, when one of the systems keeping the people inside alive can no longer function. That's the flaw most survival plans overlook. They prepare for the disaster, but they don't prepare for the dependencies that remain after it. The idea of a safe haven is powerful. Find the right location, get behind strong walls, store supplies, stay hidden, wait for the crisis to pass. It sounds logical, and sometimes sheltering in place really is the correct decision. But there is a dangerous assumption hidden inside that strategy, that if the outside world stops working, your small world can keep working normally. It can't, not indefinitely. Your house isn't an isolated survival system. It's connected to a much larger network. Water treatment, sewage, electricity, fuel distribution, telecommunications, food supply chains, medical services, roads, emergency response. When those systems work, your home feels self-sufficient. When they don't, you discover how dependent you were. And that's where preparedness changes. It stops being about how much equipment you own and becomes about how many critical functions you can keep running. The first night is usually the easiest. That's what makes it dangerous. You still have momentum. The refrigerator is full. Your water supply appears normal. Your phone may still connect. Neighbors are confused, but nobody has completely changed behavior yet. There is uncertainty, but not necessarily panic. You tell yourself help will arrive. Power crews will fix the grid. Fuel deliveries will resume. Stores will reopen. The internet will come back. And maybe they will. But a serious emergency changes the calculation. The question isn't, will this system eventually recover? It's, how long can I function before it does? That difference matters. A shelter designed for 24 hours is completely different from one designed for a week. And a shelter designed for a week is completely different from one expected to function for a month. Because the longer the disruption lasts, the more ordinary systems become survival problems. The refrigerator becomes a food preservation problem. The toilet becomes a sanitation problem. The tap becomes a water storage problem. The phone becomes a communications problem. The car becomes a fuel problem. And eventually, the house itself becomes a resource management problem. Water is where the illusion of independence starts to disappear. You look at your stored containers and calculate how many days they should last. But survival water isn't just drinking water. You need water for cooking, hygiene, cleaning, and potentially for illness, heat, or increased physical activity. Emergency guidance commonly uses a baseline of about 1 gallon per person per day for planning, while recognizing that actual needs vary. But even that number hides something important. Planning isn't only about how much water you have. It's about what happens when that water becomes your only reliable source. Because once the stored supply becomes limited, every action becomes a decision. Do you wash your hands? Do you clean the cooking surface? Do you save water for tomorrow? Do you use valuable drinking water for sanitation? Now imagine this during extreme heat, or while someone is sick, or after an injury. Your water supply isn't just a container, it's a countdown. And there's another problem. Contamination can turn a large water supply into a useless one. After an emergency, authorities may warn that tap water is unsafe. Flooding can contaminate sources, and chemical contamination presents a different problem because some contaminants cannot simply be removed by boiling. That means your plan needs to answer more than, I have water. It needs to answer, how much? Where is it stored? How will I know another source is safe? And what happens when the stored supply runs low? Because water doesn't become important when you run out. It becomes important when you realize you can't easily replace it. Then another system begins to fail. Sanitation. Under normal conditions, you use a toilet without thinking about where everything goes. You flush, the waste disappears. But it hasn't disappeared. It has simply moved into another system. And that system depends on infrastructure. Pumps, treatment facilities, electricity, water pressure, sewer networks, maintenance. When those systems are disrupted, your toilet doesn't magically become a survival solution. It becomes a container connected to a much larger problem. At first, people improvise. Then they discover how quickly sanitation can become a health issue. Waste attracts insects. Poor hygiene increases contamination risks. Cleaning consumes water. And the psychological effect matters too. Your home begins to feel less like a shelter and more like a sealed container. This is why emergency planning has to include sanitation and hygiene, not just food and weapons. A shelter that protects you from the outside world but cannot safely manage waste isn't truly self-sufficient. It's simply delaying the problem. Now you open the refrigerator, and another illusion disappears. You thought you had food, but some of what you had was actually food dependent on electricity, refrigeration, freezing, cooking, food preservation. The system was invisible because electricity made it effortless. Then the power stays off. The refrigerator gets warmer. The freezer becomes a clock. And suddenly, the food you thought represented security becomes a short-term resource that has to be managed. Food safety becomes more important because some refrigerated or frozen foods may become unsafe after a prolonged outage. So you start eating differently. Food that could spoil first gets priority. Shelf-stable food gets protected. Cooking becomes more expensive. Every meal consumes fuel, and that creates another dependency. You may have enough food, but not enough energy to prepare it. That's the difference between owning resources and having a functioning system. A box of rice is a resource. A reliable way to safely prepare it is part of the system, and systems tend to fail at their weakest dependencies. Eventually, darkness becomes normal. Your batteries begin disappearing one by one. Phone, flashlight, radio, portable devices. You start rationing power, not necessarily because you have no batteries left, but because you don't know how long the outage will last. And this changes human behavior. You stop checking your phone constantly. You stop using unnecessary lights. You become protective of charging capacity. Then you begin asking a question that didn't matter on day one. What information do I actually need? That question is more important than it sounds, because communication isn't just convenience. It affects decisions. Where is the danger? Which roads are open? Is water safe? Are emergency services operating? Has power been restored? Is evacuation recommended? Without information, uncertainty grows, and uncertainty changes behavior. People can make bad decisions not because they're irrational, but because they're making decisions with incomplete information. That's why a resilient shelter should have multiple ways to receive important information. Not because every disaster will destroy communications, because you don't know in advance which system will fail. And this is where the safe haven reveals its biggest flaw. You prepared for isolation, but you never prepared for dependency. You built a place designed to keep the outside world away, but you didn't build a system that could function without the outside world. Your shelter still depends on something. Maybe electricity, maybe water, maybe fuel, maybe a nearby road, maybe a medical facility, maybe a pharmacy, maybe a communications network, maybe another person. And suddenly, the strongest looking shelter can have a single point of failure. A single point of failure is anything that, when it stops working, causes a critical part of the system to fail. You might have 10 boxes of food, but if all your cooking depends on one fuel source, that's a dependency. You might have hundreds of liters of water, but if all of it is stored in one vulnerable location, that's a dependency. You might have a generator, but if you have limited fuel, the generator isn't permanent power, it's temporary power. And that distinction is enormous. By day 4, the physical problems aren't necessarily the hardest part. The uncertainty is. Every morning starts with the same question. Is today the day things return to normal? You listen. Nothing. You check the phone. Nothing. You look outside. The same streets. The same silence. And this creates a dangerous cycle. Hope, disappointment, frustration, decision fatigue. Small decisions become exhausting. How much water? How much food? Should you go outside? Should you stay inside? Should you help a neighbor? Should you conserve supplies? Should you trust what you heard? Should you evacuate? And the longer the uncertainty continues, the harder it becomes to maintain perfect discipline. People begin taking shortcuts. They stop recording supplies. They stop conserving water. They make emotional decisions. They argue. Someone wants to leave. Someone wants to stay. Someone believes everything will be fine. Someone believes everything is about to get worse. This is why preparedness isn't only about equipment. It's about decision-making under stress. A plan reduces the number of decisions you have to make when your brain is already overloaded. Then you discover something else. Your safe haven doesn't exist in isolation. There are people outside. Some may need help. Some may have information. Some may have useful skills. Some may have resources you don't. And some may simply be frightened. Complete isolation can protect you from certain risks, but it can also remove access to information, skills, medical assistance, cooperation, and mutual support. Preparedness isn't necessarily about trusting everyone. It's about understanding that resilience can have a social component. A neighborhood where people communicate, share information, check on vulnerable residents, and coordinate resources can respond differently from one where everyone operates independently. Your shelter is part of a larger system, whether you want it to be or not. The question is whether that connection becomes a weakness or an advantage. Then comes another resource people often underestimate: fuel. Fuel looks abundant when the supply chain is functioning. Gas stations everywhere, delivery trucks constantly moving, generators ready to start, vehicles everywhere. But fuel isn't created at the moment you need it. It has to be produced, transported, stored, distributed, and eventually consumed. A generator can give you electricity, but it doesn't give you fuel. That distinction sounds obvious, yet it changes the entire strategy. If you use your generator every hour because you want normal life, you may consume the resource that could have kept critical equipment operating later. So the question becomes, what actually needs power? Not everything. Maybe refrigeration. Maybe medical equipment. Maybe communications. Maybe water pumping. Everything else becomes optional. That's the mindset of a resilient system. Prioritize critical functions. Protect the resources that support them. Avoid wasting capacity on things that don't matter. Then someone gets injured. Not dramatically, not in some movie-style disaster. A simple injury, a cut, a fall, a burn, a fever. Something that would normally be treated without much thought. But now the medical system may be harder to reach. Transportation is uncertain. Emergency services may be overloaded. A pharmacy may be closed. And suddenly, a minor problem demands more attention. This is why medical preparedness matters. Not because everyone needs to become a doctor, but because a resilient household needs to know what it can handle and what it cannot. The dangerous mistake is assuming every problem can be solved inside your shelter. Some problems require professional medical care. A real preparedness plan needs thresholds. When can you treat something at home? When do you need outside assistance? When is evacuation necessary? And how do you communicate that decision? The shelter isn't supposed to replace civilization. It's supposed to buy you time. That distinction is critical. Eventually, you understand what the flaw actually was. It wasn't the door. It wasn't the windows. It wasn't the location. It wasn't even the amount of food. The fatal flaw was believing that safety was a place. It isn't. Safety is a functioning system. A house can be strong and still fail. A bunker can be secure and still fail. A remote cabin can be isolated and still fail. Because survival depends on more than protection from immediate threats. It depends on water, sanitation, food, energy, information, health, mobility, decision-making, and time. The longer an emergency lasts, the more important those systems become. So how do you fix the flaw? Start by mapping your dependencies. Take your home. Write down everything required for normal life. Water, electricity, food, cooking, heating or cooling, sanitation, medical care, communication, transportation. Then ask one question for every item. What happens if this stops working? Not for 1 hour, not for 1 day, for 3 days, for 1 week, for 2 weeks. That exercise changes the way you see preparedness. You stop asking, what gear should I buy? And start asking, what function must continue? That's a much better question, because equipment is only useful when it supports a function. A flashlight supports visibility. A battery supports energy. A radio supports information. Stored water supports hydration and hygiene. Food supports energy. But none of those items are the goal. The goal is maintaining the functions that keep people alive. And there's another step. Don't create only one plan. Create layers. Your first layer is staying home. What happens if that works? Your second layer is leaving temporarily. What happens if staying becomes unsafe? Your third layer is communication. Who needs to know where you are? Your fourth layer is transportation. What happens if your normal vehicle fails? Your fifth layer is outside assistance. Who can provide information, medical care, or resources? This is redundancy. And redundancy is what turns a fragile system into a more resilient one. If one path fails, another exists. If one water source becomes unsafe, another option exists. If one communication method fails, another exists. If one route becomes blocked, another exists. You don't need infinite resources. You need fewer single points of failure. Now return to the beginning. You are inside your safe haven. The lights are out. The streets are quiet. The food is still there. The walls are still standing. Nothing has physically attacked your shelter. And yet, your survival plan is already being tested. Not by an enemy, by dependency. The water system, the power system, the sanitation system, the food system, the communication system, the medical system. One by one, invisible connections begin disappearing. And that's the lesson. The safest place isn't necessarily the strongest building. It's the place where you understand what can fail before it fails. Because once you understand the dependencies, you can prepare for them. You can store what matters. You can create alternatives. You can conserve resources. You can build redundancy. And most importantly, you can recognize when staying put is no longer the safest decision. A disaster doesn't always destroy your shelter. Sometimes it simply removes everything your shelter depended on. That's why preparedness shouldn't begin with, how do I protect my house? It should begin with, what does my life depend on? Water, power, food, sanitation, medicine, transportation, information, people. Remove enough of them, and the strongest looking shelter can become a trap. But understand those systems, and something changes. You stop preparing for a fictional apocalypse. You start preparing for real failure modes. Because the goal isn't to build a place where nothing can go wrong. The goal is to build a life that can keep functioning when something does. Your safe haven doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be resilient. And resilience begins with one uncomfortable question. What is the one thing your survival plan cannot afford to lose? If this changed the way you think about preparedness, subscribe. Because the biggest survival threats aren't always the ones you can see. Sometimes they're the systems you never realized you depended on.